After studying this module, you will be able to define research and the purpose of research. You will also become familiar with the research terminology and the various research designs. You will also come to know about the various techniques of data collection and the ethical issues that are involved in research methods. So let us start by defining research. What exactly is research? Research comprises creative work undertaken on a systematic basis in order to increase the stock of knowledge, including knowledge of humans, culture and society, and the use of this stock of knowledge to devise new applications. It is used to establish or confirm facts, reaffirm the results of previous work, solve new or existing problems, support theorems, or develop new theories. A research project may also be an expansion of the past work in the same area or the same field. To test the validity of instruments, procedures, or experiments, research may replicate elements of prior projects or the project as a whole. The primary purpose of basic research as opposed to applied research are documentation, discovery, interpretation, or the research and development of methods and systems for the advancement of human knowledge. Research is a systematic method of gaining new information and helps in the following purposes that I am going to tell you now. Number one is the development of a theory. Secondly, increasing one's knowledge by providing evidence for the effectiveness of an approach or technique. Thirdly, it also helps in creating methods to assess behaviors. Moving on to the stages of research. The first stage is that you have to choose the research problem and formulate a hypothesis. Secondly, you have to go about formulating the research design. Then you have to gather the data. After you gather the data, you have to code the data. And then you have to interpret the results so as to see whether your hypothesis is proved or not proved, or we call it testing the hypothesis. Let's move on to the various research terms that you should be familiar with. Number one is that of a variable. Now, what is a variable? A variable is any general characteristic that is measurable and has different values. What are the different types of variables? First type is independent variable. A variable that causes a change of another variable. They are the presumed causes or influences which are studied in a research. For example, personality and leadership style. The next type of variable is that of dependent variable. It is assumed to assess the effect of the independent variable. For example, absenteeism and job motivation. The third type of variables are extraneous variables. These are the variables which are covariates. They abate the effect of the independent variable on the dependent variable. For example, nature of a work task. The next term that you should be familiar with is hypothesis. They are predictive statements about the relationship between the variables. Causality. The direction of cause and effect is called causality. Next term is correlation coefficient. It indicates the strength of a relationship between two variables. The range of a correlation coefficient is always between plus minus 1. Let's go on to research designs. A research design is the blueprint of the study. The design of a study defines the study type, whether it is descriptive, correlational, semi-experimental, experimental, review or meta-analytic. and subtype. For example, descriptive longitudinal case study, research question, hypothesis, independent and dependent variables, experimental design, and if applicable, data collection methods and a statistical analysis plan. Research design is the framework that has been created to seek answers to various research questions. Research designs are not perfect, but they do reflect the questions being addressed. A researcher can choose an appropriate research design keeping in mind the strengths and the weaknesses. There are many ways to classify research designs, but sometimes the distinction is artificial and other times different designs are combined. Nonetheless, I will tell you about the various research designs, and the designs are going to offer a number of useful distinctions between possible research designs. Let's start with the first one. The first one is descriptive. For example, case study or naturalistic observation and survey. Number 2 is correlational. Example, case control study and observational study. Third is the semi-experimental. Example, field experiment, quasi-experiment. Number 4 is the experimental design, which is experiment with random assignment, followed by review, which is the literature review or systematic review, and meta-analytic, which is meta-analysis. Sometimes a distinction is made between fixed and flexible, or synonymously quantitative and qualitative research designs. However, fixed designs need not be quantitative and the flexible design need not be qualitative. In fixed designs, the design of the study is fixed before the main stage of data collection. So the data collection takes place later. Fixed designs are normally theory driven. Otherwise, it is impossible to know in advance which variables need to be controlled and which are the ones which need to be measured. Often these variables are measured quantitatively. Flexible designs allow for more freedom during the data collection process itself. One reason for using a flexible research design can be that the variable of interest is not quantitatively measurable, such as culture. In other cases, theory might not be available before one starts the research. Let's move on to the case study method. Case studies are drawn from real life situations and show an in-depth analysis of one's setting. They are detailed descriptions about an organization or its employees. Well, case studies have their drawbacks like any other method. The observer might have perceptual bias and a subjective interpretation. Cases also reduce generalizability for depth of information and richness of detail. The strength of case studies are that they provide in-depth analysis of cases. They are a very good device for initial exploratory researches and for evaluation of real-life problems in any organization. Case studies are obtained through observations. They can be obtained through interview method and a review of records. Let's move on to the next. The next is field survey. A field study is done by interviewing a number of employees in different divisions or departments in one organization. The standardization of responses allows the data to be easily quantifiable, analyzed, and summarized for making inferences about a larger population. It is more economical as it is done on a small sample. However, the survey method also has some drawbacks. Firstly, Mailed questionnaires are rarely answered and rarely returned. Since the findings of field survey is thus based on low response rate, it is questionable if the findings can be generalized at all. Secondly, the format taps the employee's attitudes and personality better than the observation method. Thirdly, social desirability can take place. And fourthly, survey methods are a poor method for acquiring depth of information. So the kind of information that you get is a very superficial one. Let's move on to the next technique, which is the laboratory experiment. In a laboratory experiment, the researcher makes an artificial environment, which is understood because it is the laboratory. It is a kind of a replica of the natural environment. Then the researcher manipulates the independent variable under controlled conditions to see its effect on the dependent variable. Because of controlled conditions, the researcher is able to imply causation. The strength of a laboratory experiment is that it provides a high degree of control over variables and gives precise measurement of them. However, there are a few drawbacks of this method also. Laboratory experiment reduces realism and therefore generalizability for precision. As it is an artificial environment, it becomes difficult to generalize the studies to real life work experiment. And also, many laboratory experiments deal with phenomena that actually cannot be applied to real life situations. Now let's move on to the other form of experimentation, which is the field experiment. It is similar to the laboratory experiment, except that it is conducted in a real organization and not in a laboratory. The natural setting is more realistic than the laboratory setting, and this enhances validity, but it hinders control. Unless control groups are maintained, there can be a loss of control if extraneous variables intervene. However, many a times, organizations do not allow outside researchers to come and study their employees, and hence selection bias occurs. They are also very costly. But field experiments give the most valid and generalizable findings. Moving on to the next method, which is observation. It is a preferred method of data collection when one wants to study the behavior that occurs in some particular setting or institution in detail. The advantage of observation is that it is superior to survey research, experimentation or document study for collecting data on non-verbal behavior. It also allows an in-depth study of the whole individual. It is also a very flexible technique that allows the observer to concentrate on any variables that prove to be important for the study. Observations take place in natural environment, and researchers are able to study over a longer period if we compare it to survey or the experimental method. They are also less reactive than other data collection techniques, but the presence of a stranger and the error involved in human observation become a major disadvantage. There are other drawbacks as well of the observation technique, one of which is a little control over extraneous variables. As we all know that in data collection, the extraneous variables need to be controlled. Observation data can only be quantifiable to a certain extent only. Since observational studies are conducted in depth with subjective data, the data gathered by two researchers might not be comparable. Observations are conducted over a longer period of time, and this complicates the problem of reliability when many observers are used. Also, an observer has difficulty receiving approval for the study. The next method that I am going to teach you is document study. Documents mean any written material that contains information about a phenomenon that is wanted to be studied. Documents are both primary and secondary. Primary documents include accounts written by people who experience the event or behavior. Secondary documents, on the other hand, are written by people who are not present on the event but who receive information by interviewing the eyewitnesses or by reading the primary documents. There are certain advantages of this method. One of them is that it allows research on subjects to which the researcher does not have physical access. It is well suited to study over a long period of time. And another advantage is that the document survey can use a larger sample, which will lead to more statistically significant results. Also, spontaneous behavior can be recorded when they occur. Document analysis is less expensive than large-scale surveys. And documents are high on quality and they are very valuable. There are also some disadvantages of this method. The various goals for which documents are written can bias them in many ways. Another disadvantage is that documents get destroyed if not taken good care of. Many documents provide an incomplete account to the researcher who has had no prior experience with knowledge of the events or behaviors. There are many areas where information is actually never recorded. Mostly, well-educated people write documents. Documents lack a standard format and are written in words rather than in numbers. So, it becomes very difficult to quantify them. Let's move on to the data collection techniques. Data collection is the process of gathering and measuring information on variables of interest in an established, systematic fashion that enables one to answer stated research questions, hypotheses, and evaluate the outcomes. The data collection component of research is common to all fields of study, including physical and social sciences, humanities, business, etc. While the methods vary in discipline, the emphasis on ensuring accurate and honest collection remains the same. So, we can say that the goal of all data collection is to capture quality evidence and then translate to rich data analysis, which allows the building of a convincing and credible answer to questions that have been posed. Well, regardless of the field of study or preference for defining data, whether it is quantitative or it is qualitative, accurate data collection is essential to maintaining the integrity of research. Both the selection of appropriate data collection instruments, existing, modified or newly developed, and clearly delineated instructions for their correct use reduce the likelihood of errors occurring. A formal data collection process is necessary as it ensures that data gathered are both well defined and accurate, and that subsequent decisions based on arguments embodied in the findings are valid. The process provides both a baseline from which to measure and in certain cases a target on which to improve. Let's talk about sampling here. It is the process of selecting a part of a larger group of participants with the intent of generalizing the findings to the complete population. Sampling is less expensive than interviews, observations and surveys as a small population is selected. It takes less time to study a sample of participants. Better quality can be obtained if a reasonable amount of time is devoted to the assessment. But the only catch is that the sample should be a truly representative one of the complete population. Moving on to tests. A test is a set of problems which has right and wrong answers. There are different tests for assessment of performance, aptitude and intelligence. Let me give you an example of a test. Raven's standard progressive matrices. The next is personality inventories. They present the employees with a collection of statements describing behaviors or patterns of behaviors. The employees are then asked to indicate whether the statement is characteristic of their behavior by indicating how typical it is of them. Questionnaires. Questionnaires are a group of written questions to which participants are asked to respond in writing, often by choosing the responses out of the given alternatives. Well, questionnaires can be mailed or they can be administered online or directly in person. They are of mainly two types: open-ended questions and closed-ended questions. Open-ended questions are those which do not provide any kind of choices for the participants to select. Instead, the participant has to formulate his own answer. Closed-ended questions has options and may have items which have to be rated. Moving on to interviews. Interviews, as all of us know, they can be conducted on the telephone or they can be conducted face to face. Advantages of interview are its flexibility. Interviewers can probe for answers and can repeat a question when the participant or the employee misunderstands the question. So there is a lot of scope for clarity. The interview tends to have a better response rate than the mailed questionnaire. An interviewer can standardize the interview environment by making certain that the interview is conducted in a controlled environment. The interviewer has control over the question order. The interviewer can record spontaneous answers. He can also make sure that all the questions are answered. There is also scope for recording the non-verbal cues. However, interviews are very expensive to conduct. They generally do not provide the respondent time to conduct research and check records. The interview offers less anonymity than the mailed questionnaire study technique. However, interviews can be structured, they can be semi-structured, or they can be completely unstructured. Let's talk about the ethical issues which are very important when you are conducting any kind of research. So while conducting a research, ethical issues need to be kept in mind. It is generally agreed that it is unethical for researchers to harm anyone in the course of the research, especially if it is without the person's knowledge and permission. Researchers can act quite unethically if they falsify findings or reveal only a part of the data. The National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research in 1978 identified 3 ethical principles and guidelines for protection of human subjects. Participants should be treated as autonomous agents. Secondly, persons with delayed development and children are entitled to special protection. And thirdly, researchers should not harm the participants in any way. Consent should be taken by persons and consent may be withdrawn at any time during the study. Information about the research procedure, purpose and benefits should be disclosed to the participant beforehand. The participant should have the legal capacity and the ability to understand the information and the risks which are involved so that they can make an informed decision. The participant should also give consent without any threat of participation. Another issue which is of primal importance is that of privacy. Much of behavioral research involves asking participants to reveal some aspect of their behavior or their attitudes, or let's say their personality. If participants feel that their privacy is being invaded, they may provide with distorted answers, thereby giving misleading information. Hence, anonymity and confidentiality should be maintained. If the data is anonymous, participants are more willing to share information. Moving on to the risks involved. The most important concern about research ethics is that the individuals should not be harmed by serving as participants in any kind of study. Risks includes psychological and physical pain along with legal, economic and social harm. Deception, which is another very big problem. Research subjects can be deceived by studying them without informing them of the fact or securing their permission. Many subjects might consider such behavior as unethical and may feel as the researcher is spying on them. A common form of deception involves informing the subjects that they are a part of the study, but then deceiving them about its true nature. While conducting a research, the following assumptions should always be kept in mind. Number one, the researcher is qualified to conduct the research. Number two, the potential good from the study will outweigh the potential harm to the individual. Number three, the potential harm to the participant is relatively minor and of a short duration. Fourthly, the participant is aware of the possible dangers before giving his or her consent. In order to conduct research on social problems, the researchers often have to expose the participants to the harmful effects which are being attempted to eliminate. However, they should inform the participants of the possible harm before conducting the research and should take their consent. Researchers should reduce the potential harm to a participant to the minimum. Ethical issues should be kept in mind while conducting any kind of research. Another problem that we face nowadays is that of fabrication, which is the making up of the data or results and falsification. That is, changing the data or results should not be done while collecting the data. Let us summarize what I have taught you. Research is a systematic method of gaining new information and it helps for many purposes. A variable is any general characteristic that is measurable and has different values. Hypotheses are predictive statements about the relationship between the variables. Correlation coefficient ranges from +1 to -1. Case studies are drawn from real-life situations and show an in-depth analysis of one's setting. A field study is done by interviewing a number of employees in different divisions or departments of an organization. Experiments can be either lab experiments or they can be field experiments. Sampling is the process of selecting a part of a larger group of participants with the intent of generalizing the findings to the complete population. Questionnaires are a group of written questions to which participants are asked to respond in writing, often by choosing responses out of the given alternatives. Researchers should inform the participants of the possible harm before conducting the research and should take their consent.